Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It is a peculiarity of memory that it rarely preserves events in order of significance. Of the many cases in which I accompanied my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I have often found that the ones with the most chilling consequence arrive not with trumpet and flourish but quietly, on slippered feet. And so it was with the case of the Bengali coin, which, though lacking the immediate shock of a bloody murder or public scandal, left upon my mind a residue of unease that lingers to this day. It was in the early spring of the year 1892. The London air had begun to shed its winter cruelty, and the morning fogs rolled back a little earlier each day. Holmes and I had enjoyed a rare lull in inquiries, and I, for my part, was grateful for the peace. Holmes, on the other hand, had grown restive. I could tell by the way he paced our sitting room, arms folded behind his back, pausing occasionally to examine the ash in his pipe bowl, with a scrupulousness that betrayed his boredom. It was on such a morning that our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, brought up the card of a certain Mr. Rajan Chowduri. The name, clearly of Indian origin, was unfamiliar to me, but Holmes's eyes lit up with that unmistakable gleam, which signified, in his case, the scent of something peculiar. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson," he said briskly, before turning to me. "You will recall, Watson, that I once remarked upon the disproportionate number of interesting clients produced by the British Empire. I dare say we are about to add another to the list." The man who entered was of medium stature, finely dressed in an English-cut suit that could not quite conceal the Eastern grace in his bearing. His features were sharp, his eyes deeply set and shadowed with fatigue or anxiety, or perhaps both. He bowed slightly as he crossed the threshold, his movements deliberate and dignified. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said in a soft but precise voice, "I come to you as a man in fear, not for my life alone, but for something more elusive, more insidious. I fear I am being marked." Holmes gestured to the chair across from him. "Do sit down, Mr. Chowduri. You have the advantage of us. You know our names and reputations, while we know little of you." "I am recently returned from Calcutta," the man began, settling into the offered chair. "Until last year, I held a position with the Colonial Office. Upon my retirement, I intended to travel across Europe, but something has disrupted that course." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and drew forth a small cloth pouch. From it, he produced a single coin and laid it gently on the table before us. It was aged, copper-toned, with worn markings that seemed neither Roman nor Greek, but rather etched with unfamiliar characters, and a sun motif I did not recognize. "This," he said, "was placed on my bedside table during the night, though the door was locked from within, and no staff had access." Holmes did not touch the coin immediately. He leaned forward, scrutinizing it with a hawk-like stillness. "You believe this to be a warning?" "I know it is," Chowdhury replied. "It is the second such coin I have received in the past fortnight. The first appeared while I stayed at the Carlton. That same evening, a close friend of mine, a fellow colonial officer, was found dead. And now, at the Grand Albion, this one." His voice grew tight. "My servant, Ajit Das, was found lifeless 2 days ago. No wound, no apparent cause." There was a moment of silence in the room, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Holmes, still bent over the coin, now produced his lens and studied it silently. He turned it over, raised it to the light, and then set it back down. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting. Dr. Watson, would you mind describing the coin for your notes?" I obliged. "Small, circular, copper, or perhaps bronze, with weathered edges. There appear to be markings, possibly Bengali script, and a sun or wheel-like symbol at the centre. No visible minting year." Holmes nodded. "Excellent, Watson. And you, Mr. Chowduri, are quite certain you were alone in the room the night this object appeared?" "As certain as any man may be. I had locked the door myself from the inside. The window was latched and the bell pull untouched. No one could have entered." Holmes rose and began pacing, his hands behind his back, his brow furrowed in thought. "And you say your servant died 2 days ago. Was there an inquest?" "Yes. Natural causes, they said. But I saw him, Mr. Holmes." There was terror on his face. His eyes were wide, frozen in fear. Holmes stopped pacing. "And the previous friend, your fellow officer?" "Major Elphinstone. He suffered a sudden collapse while dining. No signs of foul play, but he too had received a coin, as I later discovered." Holmes turned sharply. "You did not mention that before." "I only confirmed it yesterday, through a mutual acquaintance. Then we are, it seems, not merely dealing with coincidence, but with a pattern. A coin appears, a death follows. Mr. Chowdhury, was there anything in your work in India that might account for such vengeance?" At this, the man stiffened. His jaw tightened, and I detected the flicker of something deeply buried behind his composed exterior. "I was involved in the dismantling of certain outlawed sects, fanatics who saw themselves as guardians of ancient rituals. There were arrests, executions. But that was years ago." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Some men forget, others forgive, but those steeped in ritual blood often do neither." He returned to the table and picked up the coin again, this time slipping it into a small envelope. "You are staying at the Grand Albion still?" "I am." "Then I suggest you do not spend the night there. Take another room elsewhere. I believe, Mr. Chowdhury, that we must pay a visit to your hotel before the trail grows colder." Chowdhury nodded gravely. "I shall do as you advise." After the gentleman had departed, Holmes turned to me, his features alight with that unmistakable intensity which heralded the beginning of a chase. "You see, Watson, not every murder is written in blood. Some come written in symbols, ancient, forgotten, and far more insidious. We are dealing, I suspect, not with a killer in the conventional sense, but with a spectre from the past, armed with knowledge, cunning, and an unwavering purpose." I felt a chill rise in my spine, though the fire had not dimmed. The coin lay in its envelope, innocuous in appearance, but somehow heavy with portent. As Holmes reached for his coat, I did likewise, and together we descended the stairs of Baker Street, already drawn into the orbit of a mystery whose roots stretched across empires and into the shadows of forgotten faith. We arrived at the Grand Albion Hotel later that afternoon, our cab pulling up to its grand stone facade beneath a sky dulled by a heavy veil of grey. Mr. Chowdhury met us in the lobby, his composure visibly strained. I noted that his eyes, already shadowed from sleeplessness, bore the tremulous glint of a man standing upon the edge of certainty and superstition. Holmes declined tea and made immediately for the lift, insisting we waste no time. "The longer the scene remains untended," he remarked, "the more likely our elusive friend is to erase his footprints." Chowdhury led us to the 3rd floor and unlocked a suite near the far end of the corridor. It was elegant in a reserved way, though a palpable unease hung in the air. "This is where Ajit was found," Chowduri said quietly, gesturing towards the adjoining chamber. Holmes gave no reply. He removed his gloves with practiced precision and passed silently through the doorway. I followed, pen and notebook in hand. The room was untouched since the morning of the tragedy, at Holmes's instruction, and the body had long since been removed. Still, the bed remained unmade, and a dressing gown had been tossed carelessly across the arm of a chair. A breakfast tray, now cold, sat upon the sideboard, its untouched teacup a stark reminder of a life abruptly halted. Holmes moved slowly, his eyes roaming across the room like those of a cat in pursuit of an unseen mouse. He paused near the writing desk, then again by the hearth. He said nothing for several minutes, and I knew better than to interrupt him when he entered that trance-like state of quiet analysis. Mr. Chowduri stood by the window, his hand resting on the sill. "He had said nothing of feeling unwell," he murmured. "In fact, he was laughing that morning, recounting some nonsense about a fortune teller in Madras. And then—" His voice faded. Holmes finally spoke. "You say no one else entered the room?" "None. I locked the suite myself before retiring. The only key, aside from my own, remains with the front desk." Holmes nodded, his gaze fixed now upon the small corridor connecting the sleeping and sitting rooms. Then the question becomes not merely who, but how. And in matters of the impossible, Mr. Chowduri, I have found that one must examine the most overlooked elements with the greatest care. With that, he stepped forward, and we followed him through the narrow passage to the bedroom where the strange death had occurred, a place, I would soon learn, that held its own peculiar signs. The bedroom into which Holmes now entered had an oppressive stillness to it, as though time itself had recoiled from the moment of Ajit Das's death and left behind a vacuum. The curtains were drawn back just slightly, and the pale light of the afternoon limped in through the tall windows, casting narrow bands upon the floorboards. Holmes made a slow circuit of the room. He paused at the bedside table, then crouched by the wardrobe and finally rose to inspect the latch of the window. He raised it gently, listening to the hinge creak, then stepped back and looked at the sill with greater intensity. I saw his expression change, the merest tightening around the eyes, and I knew he had seen something. "Watson," he said softly, "your medical bag. Do you have a scalpel or blade?" I retrieved it from my coat pocket and handed it to him. Holmes knelt, using the fine edge of the blade to scrape gently at the inside edge of the windowsill. After a moment, he held up the tip of the blade to the light. "Red," he murmured. "Dust. Very fine. Not native to this climate." I leaned forward to inspect it. "Brick dust?" "Possibly. But I would wager this is not from any London construction site. Laterite soil, I suspect, distinctive to certain regions of India." He folded the dust carefully into a scrap of paper and tucked it into his notebook. Chowduri was visibly unsettled. "But the window, surely it was closed?" Holmes nodded. "Indeed, and latched. Yet this dust is not here by chance. It suggests the window was opened, if only briefly. The presence of such foreign soil speaks volumes." He moved next to the bed and pointed to the pillow. "No struggle. No signs of a seizure or collapse. The position of the sheets suggests a peaceful sleep. And yet," I said, "the man was dead by morning." Holmes's eyes met mine. "That, my dear Watson, is what makes this matter so captivating. When men die in peace from unnatural causes, one must look for methods as silent as they are deadly." He turned his attention toward the floorboards beneath the bed, crouching again, fingers running along the skirting. "And what's this?" there was a faint scuff mark along the corner of the rug, as though something had been dragged and then hastily concealed. He pulled back the carpet, and beneath it, barely tucked under the floorboard, was the first of many clues that would lead us deeper into the heart of an ancient vengeance. Holmes drew back the rug fully and peered beneath the edge of the floorboard where the scuff mark had been. With a narrow-bladed penknife, he pried gently at the seam until a faint creak rewarded his efforts. The board lifted with unexpected ease, revealing a shallow cavity barely 2 inches deep. Within it, gleaming faintly in the dim light, lay a curious object. A small silver whistle, no longer than a finger's length, fashioned with an unusual bulb at its mouth and a slit design I had never before encountered. Holmes retrieved it delicately and held it up to the light. "Unmistakable," he muttered, "and far from ornamental. This, Watson, is a piece of some specific utility." I leaned forward. "A child's toy, perhaps? Or a dog whistle?" He shook his head. "Neither. Observe the craftsmanship. It is not European, but Eastern. The design is functional and precise. A summoning instrument, I would wager, and one whose sound is not meant for human ears." Chowduri, who had remained near the doorway, stepped forward abruptly. "I have never seen that before. It was not mine, nor Ajit's." Holmes raised a brow. "Of that I have no doubt. One does not conceal a whistle beneath the bed of a dying man unless its use precedes the act. It was left behind, perhaps unintentionally. A mistake. And mistakes, Watson, are far more instructive than intentions." He folded the whistle into his handkerchief with a gentle precision, as though it were some delicate relic, and slipped it into his coat. "This, gentlemen," Holmes said, standing slowly, "is not merely a clue. It is an instrument of method, and I begin to suspect that this death was neither natural nor spontaneous, but executed with a degree of planning that warrants our fullest attention. After securing the room against intrusion and leaving brief instruction with the hotel management not to disturb the scene further, Holmes suggested we descend to make inquiries among the staff. "The criminal may leave no footprints," he said, "but fear often does, and in my experience, it is the most insignificant of men who are least equipped to conceal it." We found the manager at his desk in the lobby, a trim man by the name of Willoughby, whose concern for the hotel's reputation was clearly paramount. Holmes, ever the diplomat when needed, assured him that we had no intention of involving the press, and requested the presence of the night staff for a few brief questions. One by one, the bellboys, porters and night attendants presented themselves in the service corridor near the kitchen entrance. All answered Holmes's queries with the expected blend of formality and confusion. All, that is, save one. The last to arrive was a stout man with greying whiskers and a weathered complexion that bespoke long exposure to tropical sun. He identified himself as Mr. Harland, a night doorman, formerly of the Bombay Club and more recently employed at the Grand Albion. Holmes's interest sharpened visibly. "You served in India?" he inquired. 15 years, sir. Anglo-Indian clubs and regimental quarters mostly," Harland replied. "Interesting. And were you acquainted with Mr. Chowduri or his servant prior to their stay here?" "No, sir. I only learned their names from the register." "Did you see or hear anything out of the ordinary on the night in question?" Harland hesitated, then gave a perfunctory shake of the head. But I noted a tremor in his hand, the slightest delay in his response. Holmes gave a small, knowing smile. "You will forgive me, Mr. Harland, if I ask that you not leave the premises for the next 48 hours. It is possible your recollections may yet prove useful." Harland bowed stiffly, and Holmes turned on his heel, murmuring to me, "Mark that man, Watson. There's a tangle of jungle vines in his past, and I suspect they are not entirely of the botanical variety." As we returned to our lodgings at Baker Street later that evening, Holmes seated himself by the fire with the same stillness I had seen during many of our most perplexing cases. He drew forth the Bengali coin once more, setting it upon the table as a jeweller might place a diamond beneath glass. "It is curious," he began, "how something so small, so seemingly inconsequential, can stir such profound dread in men." I glanced at the token. "It does not appear valuable. The copper is worn, and the markings are indistinct." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "But its value, Watson, lies not in metal, but in meaning." He retrieved a small monograph from his personal collection and leafed through its pages until he found what he sought: a crude illustration of a coin nearly identical in design. "This is a token once used by the Thuggy cults of Bengal, Watson. It was their symbol of impending death, left on a victim's person or property as a harbinger of what would follow." "Thuggy," I said, my voice low. "The stranglers of the East." "Precisely. Though the British campaign of suppression largely destroyed their networks, remnants linger, particularly among those who view the colonial order as desecration. For such men, vengeance is not only a motive, it is a doctrine." Holmes picked up the coin and turned it in the light. "And so it appears that Mr. Chowduri's past associations have drawn the attention of a hand steeped in ancient ritual. This is no common murder, Watson. It is something older, something ceremonial." A silence fell between us. I felt a heaviness settle upon the room, not of fear precisely, but of deep foreboding. Holmes, as if sensing my thoughts, said quietly, "You see now, Watson, why I could not dismiss this matter as mere coincidence. When the past returns, it rarely knocks at the door. It leaves a coin upon the table and waits." It was upon our return to Baker Street the following morning that the case took a sinister and unmistakably personal turn. Mrs. Hudson, whose composure had weathered all manner of Holmes's eccentricities, looked somewhat perturbed as she handed over a small envelope to my friend. "This arrived not 10 minutes past, sir. There was no postmark. A boy in a red scarf delivered it, said nothing, and was gone before I could inquire further." Holmes took the envelope, weighed it briefly in his hand, and then sliced it open with the blade of his letter opener. A single folded paper lay within, bearing several lines in a script I could not decipher. "It is Urdu," he remarked after the briefest glance. "A language I am only passingly acquainted with, though enough to capture the sentiment." He read the lines aloud, translating as he went. "Withdraw your gaze from what was meant to be buried. The eyes of the dead are open still. Let them not fall upon you." A silence followed the recitation, during which even Holmes seemed momentarily still. I could not suppress a chill that worked its way along my spine. "What do you make of it?" I asked. He folded the note neatly and placed it upon the mantel. A warning, clearly. But more than that, a performance. Whoever sent it seeks to instill fear through symbolism, through the poetry of menace. That, Watson, is not the hand of a hired thug. It is the voice of doctrine. "You mean—" "I mean that our opponent is not merely a criminal. He is an adherent to something ancient, something rigid. This is not revenge in the common, hot-blooded sense. It is a ritual execution carried out in cold deliberation." I stood by the window, watching the drifting smoke of chimney pots spiral into the grey sky. And yet, you continue undeterred. He smiled faintly. It is precisely because of such warnings that I persist. When a man seeks to frighten you away from the truth, Watson, it is only because the truth has teeth. Later that day, Holmes requested Mr. Chowduri's presence once more at Baker Street. The former colonial official arrived with the same dignity and restraint as before, but there was now a distinct air of weariness in his expression. Holmes wasted no time with pleasantries. "Mr. Chowduri," he began, "we must speak plainly. It is no longer sufficient to treat this case as the idle workings of coincidence or obsession. Someone has marked you, and those who once stood beside you, for death. We must understand why." Chowduri hesitated, then nodded gravely. "I feared it might come to this." He sat, hands clasped before him. 10 years ago, in the Bengal interior, I was assigned to a special commission tasked with uprooting remnants of the Thuggy Brotherhood. Though the sect had largely dissolved, we uncovered a small but fanatical enclave. They had hidden themselves within a rural monastery under the guise of mendicants and holy men. "What became of them?" Holmes asked. "They were arrested and tried. 3 were executed. 1 escaped. Name? Unknown. He was never caught, but I recall his face. Young, silent, eyes like coals beneath water." Holmes leaned back in his chair. "You believe this man may be behind the murders?" "I cannot be certain, but I suspect the vengeance is not merely personal, it is symbolic. The coin, the snake, the silence. They are not tools of convenience, but of belief." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Then we must proceed with equal devotion." He rose and crossed to the shelf, pulling down a dog-eared volume of colonial intelligence reports. As he leafed through the pages, I caught a brief glimpse of an illustration. A ceremonial blade curved like a crescent moon, with inscriptions along the hilt. "You may have dismantled their temple," Holmes said, eyes never leaving the text, "but you did not kill the faith, and it is faith, Watson, not hatred, that sustains such men. The past has not returned by chance. It has returned by right." The telegram arrived shortly after midday. Holmes opened it with the same calm indifference with which one might read the weather report, until his eyes narrowed, and he handed it to me without a word. It was from Inspector Lestrade, requesting Holmes's presence at the chambers of Major Henry Elphinstone, retired colonial officer, and, as Holmes had previously confirmed, one of Mr. Chowduri's former associates from India. The message was chilling in its brevity. "Major Elphinstone found deceased in residence. Circumstances unclear. Object in hand may be of interest. Request immediate consultation. Lestrade." Within the hour, we were en route to the Major's quarters in Kensington. The inspector greeted us at the door, his face drawn and unusually grave. "Another one," he said simply, "and the devil take me if it ain't stranger than the last." Holmes did not wait for further preamble. He moved with swift precision to the drawing room where the body still lay. Major Elphinstone, a man of formidable frame and once a soldier of great reputation, sat slumped in his armchair. His eyes were closed, and his face, though pale, bore no sign of struggle or distress. It was his right hand that drew Holmes's attention. The fingers were clenched tightly around a small circular object. Holmes pried them open with care. There, dull in colour and nearly identical to the one delivered to Mr. Chowduri, lay a second Bengali coin. "Another death, another token," I murmured. Holmes did not speak for a moment. He stood, lips pressed into a tight line, gaze sweeping the room. "No sign of forced entry," Lestrade said. "No wounds, No poisons detected as yet. The coroner's baffled. Holmes turned to him. And the coin? None of us recognized it, just thought it peculiar. It is far more than that, Holmes replied. It is the signature of the killer, or rather, the priest. He turned to me. 2 victims, both formerly colonial officials, both tied to the suppression of a cult in Bengal. The coin is not merely symbolic, it is a sentence passed. And the executioner? I asked. Holmes's eyes were dark, still at large, and precise, which makes him all the more dangerous. We departed Elphinstone's residence as evening descended upon the city. The streets were blanketed in a damp, rising fog, the kind that clings to coat collars and hangs low over the cobbles like a smothering shroud. Holmes walked briskly ahead, his stride deliberate, hands buried in the pockets of his greatcoat. I followed close behind, yet could not shake the feeling that we were not alone. There was no sound save for the distant clatter of a hansom and the muffled whistle of a constable. But every so often, just out of earshot, just beyond the veil of the fog, I fancied I heard the faint echo of a second set of footsteps, pausing when we paused, resuming when we resumed. Holmes, I said quietly, glancing behind us. I believe we're being followed. I know, he said without looking back. You've seen him. Number. But I feel him. The pressure of eyes on one's back is not so easily mistaken. Keep walking. We turned onto a quieter lane, and Holmes abruptly ducked into a narrow alley between 2 warehouses, pulling me after him. We waited. Long moments passed, and then a figure, indistinct, wrapped in a long cloak, appeared at the mouth of the alley. It hesitated, as if uncertain, but then, as if aware it had been detected, it vanished back into the mist. Holmes released a slow breath. He's cautious, observing, not ready to strike yet. Who do you think it was? Someone with a stake in our silence. But the game, Watson, is only just beginning, and our opponent prefers to play in the dark. Our next course brought us to the East End, where Holmes had arranged a meeting through discreet channels with a man once in the employ of Major Elphinstone. The former servant, Imran Beg, now kept a modest lodging near Whitechapel, and had, according to Holmes, the look of a man trying very hard to forget something he cannot. The fellow received us nervously, his hands wringing the edge of his cap, and cast repeated glances toward the curtained window as though expecting shadows to slip beneath it. "Please, Sahib," he said in hushed tones. "I have done no wrong. I left India to be free of such things." "You are not accused of anything," Holmes replied calmly. "But you knew Major Elphinstone, and you knew of the coin." At this, Imran paled and pressed his hands together. "I saw it once, before, in Assam. A coin like that, left on the threshold of the shrine. That night, a priest was found dead in his bed, his mouth full of blood." Holmes nodded slowly. "And the name Nizam?" Imran flinched. "Snake man, executioner. He served the Brotherhood. Not openly, never openly, but they say he could charm the cobra with his breath. They say he never speaks, only whistles." Holmes cast a knowing glance in my direction. "And where would one look for such a man?" Imran hesitated. "If he is here, the docks, the spice quarter, somewhere low and dark." Holmes stood. "You have been most helpful, Mr. Begg. Keep to your silence, for your safety. But know this, the eyes that follow you may not belong to spirits, but to something far colder." True to form, Holmes wasted no time in following the trail suggested by Imran's words. That same afternoon, we arrived at a shop nestled in a crooked lane near Limehouse, where a collector and dealer in rare Eastern artifacts kept his trade. The proprietor, a wiry gentleman by the name of Mr. Hensley, greeted Holmes as an old acquaintance. "Still chasing shadows, are you?" he asked with a wink. "Only when the shadows carry fangs," Holmes replied. "Tell me, Hensley, has a man of Eastern origin, tall, silent, perhaps wearing a scar across his cheek, purchased any ceremonial weaponry in the last month?" Hensley raised an eyebrow. "Indeed. A week ago. Acquired a curved ritual blade from Burma, said little, paid in sovereigns." "Did he whistle?" Holmes asked suddenly. "Now that you mention it, yes. Odd little sound he made when inspecting the blade. Gave me chills." Holmes thanked him and made note of the transaction. Outside, he turned to me. "We have found our serpent, Watson, and now we must learn when he intends to strike." That evening, Holmes dispatched me on a singular errand to shadow Mr. Harland, the doorman from the Grand Albion. "Say nothing. Do nothing. Simply observe. He is the link. I am certain of it," Holmes instructed, his tone as sharp as I had ever heard it. Thus, I positioned myself that night across the road from the hotel entrance, collar turned up, eyes fixed on the door. Harland emerged just past 11, glancing cautiously about before setting off into the fog-bound streets of London. What I witnessed that night would carry us straight to the jaws of the trap Holmes had already begun to lay. I have often remarked, both in these memoirs and to Holmes himself, upon the peculiar calm that settles over my friend when the most dangerous of prospects lies immediately ahead. Far from appearing burdened by the gravity of events, he would instead become uncommonly quiet, his movements precise, his words few, and his manner that of a man orchestrating a performance only he could fully perceive. Such was his demeanour on the evening we returned once more to the Grand Albion Hotel, having arranged with Mr. Chowduri to occupy the same suite in which his servant had perished. "This will be our stage," Holmes murmured, scanning the room with a critical eye. "And tonight, the curtain shall rise." The room had been restored to order, but Holmes instructed the staff to leave it precisely as it had appeared before. He then retrieved from his coat a replica of the Bengali coin, forged with astonishing accuracy by one of his contacts at Scotland Yard's forgery division, and placed it upon the nightstand, plainly visible beneath the lamplight. "It must be seen," he said. "That is key. The ritual demands visibility. The coin is not merely a signal to the victim, it is a mark of sanctified intent." He handed me a small service revolver, unloaded, per my request, and motioned toward the adjoining room. "You are to remain here, behind the curtain. Say nothing. Do nothing, unless I call for you. We must catch him in the act. And if he does not come—" "He will come," Holmes said simply. "He has killed twice already, and the final name on his list sleeps here tonight. His sense of completion is ritualistic. It cannot abide an unfinished circle." Mr. Chowduri, though visibly shaken, agreed to retire early and feign sleep. Holmes reassured him quietly. "You are not alone tonight. Let him come. We are waiting." As the clock neared midnight, Holmes extinguished the fire, closed the curtains, and took his position in the shadows opposite the bed. I crouched behind the heavy drapes, heart pounding against my ribs, every nerve alive with anticipation. And so we waited for death, or the man who carried it. The silence was complete. Not the natural stillness of night, but that peculiar kind of silence which one senses before a storm, dense, anticipatory, laced with something unseen. I scarcely breathed behind the curtain, the revolver held loosely in one hand, and my ears straining for the faintest sound. The minute hand of the clock passed the 12th stroke. Then it came. A soft rustle so faint it might have been imagined, followed by a low creak, like leather brushing against wood. Holmes had spoken of a hidden servants' passage in the architecture of the Grand Albion, an anachronistic remnant from its earlier design. It was from this passage I now understood that the danger would emerge. Another sound, the metallic click of a panel shifting, preceded the appearance of a figure, cloaked and hooded, who stepped noiselessly into the bedroom. The intruder moved with purpose toward the bed, and even from my vantage, I could see the glint of something serpentine in his hand. A basket, low and round, from which an ominous hissing emanated. Holmes remained utterly still. The man placed the basket on the floor beside the bed, then knelt. With one hand, he produced something from his cloak. Though I could not see it clearly, I recognized the shape. A whistle, identical to the one Holmes had found beneath Ajit Das's mattress. The figure raised it to his lips and blew. No sound emerged, but the snake's movements changed at once. The hissing grew louder, and its head lifted above the rim of the basket. That was when Holmes moved. "Hold it there, Nizam," he said coldly, stepping from the shadows. "Not another inch." The hooded man froze. The cobra hovered, its hood flared, hypnotized by its master's stillness. "I would not recommend further use of that whistle," Holmes continued. "My friend behind the curtain is armed, and you are surrounded." I emerged, revolver in hand, just as Inspector Lestrade and two constables burst through the main entrance of the suite, pistols drawn. The man, Nizam, as Holmes had named him, did not resist. His expression was unreadable, his eyes distant, as though he were merely the vessel for some ancient duty now fulfilled or foiled. The snake was swiftly captured, and Nizam shackled. As he was led away, Mr. Chowduri emerged from the bed, pale and shaken. Holmes turned to him with a rare gentleness. "You are safe now," he said. "But know this, the ghosts we conjure from our past do not always come as memories. Sometimes they come with fangs." For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The cobra, emerging slowly from its basket, wavered between stillness and strike, its eyes fixed, if such creatures indeed possess vision, on the bed where Mr. Chowduri lay, feigning slumber. Its hood was flared, its body taut with venomous intention. Nizam, though cornered, remained knelt beside the basket, his fingers inching subtly toward the whistle concealed in his robes. Holmes, whose revolver remained lowered but steady, gave him a single warning glance. "Do not try it," he said flatly. "Another movement, and your ritual ends in lead." But Nizam's eyes flicked toward the snake, less in fear than in reverence. He whispered something in a tongue I did not know, barely audible, yet unmistakably rhythmic. It was not prayer, but invocation. I took one step forward. The cobra began to shift. With terrifying grace, it slithered fully out of the basket and glided toward the foot of the bed. Mr. Chowduri gave a visible twitch of alarm, too sudden, too real, and the serpent reared. "Now, Watson!" Holmes cried. Without hesitation, I swung the heavy bedsheet down over the snake and pressed my boot upon it, trapping the creature beneath the fabric. Lestrade and the constables descended upon Nizam at once, dragging him to his feet and wresting the whistle from his grasp. The serpent hissed violently beneath the cloth, but subdued and disoriented, it no longer posed immediate danger. One of the constables secured the basket and carefully slid the creature back inside. Holmes moved to Nizam and examined his face closely. There was no fear, no panic. Only the calm stillness of a man for whom consequences no longer mattered. "He was prepared to kill again," Holmes muttered, "and would have done so, had we waited a moment longer." Chowduri, pale but upright, approached with trembling steps. "You saved my life." Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "I merely interrupted a ceremony. The real question now, Mr. Chowduri, is, who performed the last one with him?" Nizam was taken at once to Scotland Yard under tight supervision. Though he offered no resistance, and indeed spoke no word for several hours, Holmes anticipated the silence would not last. It was not arrogance on his part, but rather an astute understanding of the human condition. Rituals may bind men to codes, but even the most devout priest cannot always silence the weight of consequence. The confession came at dusk. "I do not act alone," Nizam murmured, his voice smooth, low, and oddly melodic. "I am the hand, not the mind." Lestrade leaned forward. "Who gives the orders?" "The name is not spoken. We are of the Andhaka Darshan, the Brotherhood of the Blind Path. We remember what was burned. We remember what was desecrated by foreign boots." Holmes was still. "And Chowduri. He is the last. His name was carved into the stone long before I crossed the sea. The others, the major, the servant, each had their part. Each stepped upon the relic, spat upon the shrine. You were sent for vengeance, for balance." Holmes steepled his fingers. "The Bengali coin, the whistle, the cobra, all symbols of your rights." Nizam inclined his head. "The coin is judgment, the snake is execution, the whistle, the summons." Holmes spoke now more quietly. "You have travelled across continents for this. I was born in the dark. I serve what dwells there still." Lestrade scoffed, but Holmes remained contemplative. "Do you act alone in this city?" Nizam's eyes flickered. "No serpent slithers freely in London without a garden wall." It was all Holmes needed. He stood, gathering his coat. "The garden wall, Lestrade. Let us go uproot it." And as we left the yard, Holmes turned to me and said, "Faith can make a weapon of anything, Watson, even silence." We returned at once to the Grand Albion. Holmes wasted no time. Upon arrival, he requested the presence of Mr. Harland, the night doorman who had first drawn our suspicion. The man appeared with forced calm, his hands clasped behind his back, though a slight tremor in his jaw betrayed him. "Mr. Harland," Holmes said without preamble, "we have arrested a man named Nizam, a snake charmer, a ritualist, and a murderer. You know him." Harland remained still. "Never heard the name." Holmes stepped forward. "And yet you allowed him access to Mr. Chowdhury's suite through the old servant's passage. You signalled with a lantern in the south stairwell. You opened the panel doors." Holmes raised a finger. "He paid you. Not for silence, but for timing, so he might slip in at the appointed hour and leave again unseen." Harland's composure faltered. "I didn't know he meant to kill." "No?" Holmes's tone grew cold. "Then why did you lie to me? Why did you shake when I mentioned Bengal?" At last, Harland crumbled. He was taken into custody, weeping into his sleeves. As we stepped back into the gaslit street, Holmes murmured, "Even the garden wall, Watson, cannot stand when the roots rot beneath it." 2 days later, we found ourselves once more at Baker Street. The familiar scent of pipe smoke and faintly musty paper wrapping round us like a welcome fog. The case, though in appearance resolved, still clung to the corners of my mind like the last remnants of a storm at sea, its windless silence more unnerving than the tempest itself. Mr. Rajan Chowdhury, having insisted on a final audience with Holmes before his departure from England, sat across from the hearth. Though his composure had largely returned, there remained a subtle stiffness in his bearing, as though the tension had taken root somewhere deep within the bones. Holmes, who had been silent for some time, now rose and addressed him directly. "You have been a soldier of empire, Mr. Chowduri," he said, "and you have faced enemies in forms both visible and obscure. But I dare say none has matched the elegance of this one, cloaked not in malice alone, but in meaning." Chowdhury nodded slowly. "It was never about the individuals, was it? It was the symbol I became." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, you were not the man, you were the memory. Nizam's blade was not directed at your flesh, but at your past." "I suppose," Chowdhury said, "I must live with the ghosts I helped create." "Better that," Holmes replied, "than to die by one." He turned then to me, as he often did when ready to elucidate his chain of reasoning. "Watson, our case has closed not with the unmasking of a mere murderer, but with the uncoiling of a belief system, one which, though born of mysticism, acted through cold precision. It is time you understood each thread, and how they wove the fabric of this affair." I reached for my notebook without hesitation. The tale, after all, was not yet complete, nor was the explanation that would bring its shadowed parts into light. Holmes lifted the Bengali coin from the mantel and held it aloft between two fingers. Its surface was worn smooth at the edges, but the engraved symbol, an abstract sunburst within a circle, remained just visible under the flicker of lamplight. "This, Watson," he said, "is no mere trinket. It is an announcement. A herald, if you will, of doom." I leaned closer. "The coin was left as a warning?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely, but not for the purpose of escape. No, the coin was never meant to deter. It was meant to instill terror, a terror rooted not in logic, but in superstition. Among the Thuggy, it was once customary to present such a coin to a marked man, often days before his death. The act transformed the murder into a ritual and the victim into a sacrifice. And yet the modern world dismissed it as folklore." Holmes gave a thin smile. "As it often does, until folklore bleeds." He placed the coin carefully on the table. What made this case dangerous was not merely the presence of death, but the absence of conventional motive. We are accustomed to crimes of passion, greed, desperation. But this was murder as ceremony. Each victim was chosen not for who they were in the present, but what they represented to a doctrine buried beneath the surface of civilization. "And the coin," I said slowly, "was not left behind in haste. It was intentional, calculated as calculated," Holmes said, "as the cobra, the whistle, the timing of the strike. These were not accidents. They were components of a design, one which depended on fear as much as poison." Chowdhury's eyes remained fixed on the coin, his expression unreadable. Holmes continued, "We were not solving a crime, Watson. We were interrupting a ritual, and in doing so, we broke the sequence." There was a moment of silence, then Holmes added, "It is a curious thing, is it not, that the smallest piece of copper, pressed by ancient hands, should travel so far, only to carry out the sentence it began centuries ago." Holmes took from the table a small object wrapped in cloth and carefully unrolled it before us. Within lay the silver whistle we had retrieved from beneath the bed in Chowdhury's hotel suite, simple in design, but unlike any instrument of English make. "I confess," Holmes began, "that of all the elements in this case, this whistle fascinated me most, for it was not a mere prop, but the true murder weapon. The cobra, the coin, these were the symbols, but the whistle, that was the lever." I leaned forward, intrigued. "And it produces no sound?" "None that you or I could detect," Holmes replied. "But to a serpent, trained from hatching to respond to its frequency, it is as clear as a trumpet blast." He set the whistle down beside the coin. Nizam did not act in impulse. He bred the creature, or acquired it from those who had, and trained it to strike at a precise tone. The cobra, as you recall, displayed no aggression until he blew upon this device. Its reaction was instantaneous. Chowduri sat forward, his voice low. Then it was not poison administered by hand, but by fang. Holmes nodded. Indeed, the snake, kept hidden in a basket or beneath floorboards, would emerge when called and strike its mark. The victim, often asleep or unaware, would suffer a bite without ever glimpsing the creature. The death would appear sudden, inexplicable. The toxin of such serpents, if not identified quickly, leaves little trace after circulation ceases. But why, I asked, use such a complicated method? Because the deaths were not meant to be understood, Holmes answered. They were designed to resemble judgment, silent, spectral, untraceable. Nizam's purpose was not only execution, but terror. Fear is a far more obedient accomplice than logic. He stood and turned to the fire, the flickering light casting long shadows across the walls. You see, Watson, in an age of machines and microscopes, it is still possible for men to die by myths, so long as another man is willing to give the myth teeth. He paused, then added softly, and in this case, the teeth were very much real. Holmes resumed his seat and drew from his inner coat a folded blueprint, yellowed with age and marked with annotations in his fine, angular hand. This, he said, laying it across the table, is the original floor plan of the Grand Albion Hotel, acquired through the gracious disinterest of the city surveyor's office. I peered over his shoulder. What are we looking for? Something that no longer exists to the modern eye, but very much exists in fact. You see here, he pointed to a narrow line bordering the third-floor suites, a former servant's passage, now sealed in parts, but intact in others. It runs behind the panelled walls of the upper west wing, terminating at a disused linen chute. Then Nizam entered and exited through that very route. He was not seen because he was never meant to be. The passage allowed him to reach Mr. Chowdhury's room without use of hall or door. He entered through the servant's panel at the corner of the suite, deposited the coin, released the serpent, and waited. When the deed was done, he vanished the same way. Chowdhury said quietly, and Harland, he knew of this. Holmes nodded. The passage is no longer listed on staff schematics, but a man who had served in India and worked long years in such establishments would know. He signalled the precise moment, perhaps by lantern or light in the hall, and unlocked the inner service access. I sat back in my chair, struck by the ingenuity and patience of the crime. It is terrifying, I said, to think how easily one could die in a locked room without a soul laying a hand upon him. Holmes's expression grew grave. That, Watson, was the genius of it. Not to confront, but to appear as fate. The death that comes without footprint or blade is the most difficult to pursue and the most haunting to remember. Holmes returned to his desk and withdrew from its drawer a folded handkerchief, within which he had preserved the curious substance collected from the windowsill at the Grand Albion. He opened it carefully, and once again the fine grains of red powder gleamed under the lamp's glow. "You recall this, Watson?" he asked, holding it toward me. "The dust we discovered on the windowsill of Mr. Chowdhury's suite." "Yes, brick dust, or so we thought." "Not brick," Holmes corrected, "but laterite, a soil rich in iron and alumina and uniquely red in hue. Common in regions of eastern India, particularly around certain temples near Murshidabad. And more crucially, found only where sacred grounds have long stood. I stared at the dust anew, now endowed with a significance that reached far beyond its humble appearance. This was no accidental residue, Holmes continued. It is the footprint of the past. Nizam carried it with him, on his robes, on his instruments, because he came not only as a killer, but as a messenger. He had stood where that soil lay, perhaps in worship, perhaps in oath, and in delivering death, he brought with him the memory of a relic desecrated. Chowduri leaned forward. The shrine we raided, 10 years ago, it stood upon that soil. Holmes nodded solemnly. You desecrated what they considered sacred. You dismantled what they called home. You saw it as duty. They saw it as war. So, I said slowly, the killings were not for gain, nor hatred in its basest form, but vengeance sanctified by ritual. Indeed, Holmes replied, each victim marked by the coin, each death orchestrated to mirror the rite, the blade, the snake, the silence, all pieces of a long ceremony now concluded. He turned back to the handkerchief and folded it with care. Red dust, Watson. It stains nothing but carries everything. The past, after all, leaves traces not only in books and bones, but in the corners of windowsills, where justice drifts in quietly, unseen. We sat in silence for some time after Holmes concluded his explanation, the fire casting long fingers of light upon the ceiling. Mr. Chowduri had taken his leave with a bow and a wordless expression that spoke more of burden than of gratitude. I watched Holmes refill his pipe, his movements deliberate, his mind, though composed, clearly still engaged with threads too fine for me to follow. Holmes, I said at last, do you think it shall end here? He exhaled slowly. For now, yes. But the Empire casts a long shadow, Watson. Its reach touches every corner of the world, and every corner responds, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in blood. There was no triumph in his tone. No satisfaction, only a quiet awareness that the world we inhabited was no longer ruled solely by logic and law, but haunted by history. I wonder, I murmured, how many more such echoes are yet to reach us? Holmes tapped his pipe against the hearth. That is the trouble with ghosts, Watson. They do not require doors to enter. His eyes returned to the coin, now resting upon the mantel. And the past, he added, has a way of walking with us, whether we choose to see it or not. The evening waned, and I rose to take my leave. Holmes remained seated, the flicker of the gas lamp illuminating one side of his face, the other half obscured in shadow. As I reached the door, I paused and turned. What will become of the coin? I asked. Holmes held it up between his fingers, the ancient copper catching a brief glint. It shall remain here, Watson, he said. A reminder, not of superstition nor savagery, but of consequence. He rose and placed the coin upon the mantel, beside his violin and a scrap of the London Times. Then he added, almost to himself, Strange, is it not, Watson, that a mere piece of copper, once passed through trembling hands in the heat of Bengal, should find itself echoing through the alleys of London? He turned back to the fire, his voice now quieter, yet curiously resolute. Justice, it seems, travels far. And with that, I stepped into the quiet of Baker Street, the door closing gently behind me, the chill of night brushing against my collar. But even as I walked homeward, the shape of the coin remained etched in my mind, a symbol of a world we so often pretend is gone, though it continues to speak, in tongues we have yet to understand. As the last embers of the fire dimmed in the grate, Holmes leaned back in his chair, the silhouette of the worn Bengali coin still resting on the mantel beside him. You see, Watson, he said quietly, the most dangerous crimes are not those born of greed or desperation, but of belief. Belief rooted so deeply that it survives exile, silence, even time itself. I nodded. To Nizam, the coin was more than a warning. It was a sentence passed. Quite so, Holmes replied. And in such cases, logic alone does not suffice. One must understand not merely how the crime was done, but why it mattered to the man who did it. He paused, turning the coin over once more in his fingers. Some relics travel not as artifacts, but as burdens, and some vengeance arrives not as rage, but as ritual. Now tell me, dear readers, what do you believe was the criminal's greatest mistake? Was it the coin left too precisely, the whistle beneath the floorboard, or trusting a doorman with loose conscience and trembling hands? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Your deduction may yet rival Holmes himself. If this mystery stirred your curiosity, be sure to subscribe for more classic Sherlock Holmes cases, each one as strange and singular as the last. Share this case with fellow lovers of mystery and let them decide, would they have solved it before the serpent struck? Until our next case, keep your mind sharp and your eyes sharper. Dr. John H. Watson.